All right, everybody, welcome to Middle Ground Mike. Every election feels like it's the most important one in history, unfortunately. Everybody feels outrage and it feels unprecedented, like it's never hit this before. Every crisis now, seemingly every day, feels brand new. But what if none of it is? The chaos we're living in isn't random, it isn't accidental. And is it even new or is it just different? We got a great guest here today that's going to help us break some of this down, Dennis Brennan. Dennis, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
Yeah, introduce yourself to everybody. Tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you're about.
Sure. I'm an attorney for over 30 years. I'm a new author. I've written a book now. So I'm out there talking about that a lot. But my background started journalism from the Chicago area and the suburbs, not in the city. I studied journalism, worked for a few small news outlets, even had owned my own for a while. Saw media bias up close, even was part of it at times on both ends, because I also held office, village trustee, school board president, just a school board member, also township collector, run for a few things, helped other people run for offices, statewide, county. And I saw some of the good and the bad of that when you're involved in politics. So I was able to do everything from run campaigns to knock on doors.
Right. I mean, speaking of campaign, people feel like nothing changes, right? Because structurally, very little does. That's the unfortunate part. But the public the public senses stagnation, but it's, to me, it's not because they're disengaged, but because of, the institutions move slower, even though we're in this age of hyper modern, everything's fast. It just moves like it did 100 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, the only difference you see now really is the communication that's immediate and the response, right? If you're on any of the social media outlets, X, I'm on quite a bit, more stalking, I'd say, looking to see for people, what they're posting, that kind of thing. But you see that
Yeah.
people respond quickly, back in, early days, and even 30 years ago, you could get away with a lot of things in campaigns that you can't do anymore. Now you can have an instantaneous response to something, and that works both ways. It's similar to committing a crime. There's cameras everywhere, so you better be careful if you're out committing a crime. Where 50 years ago they could do whatever they wanted, and nobody had them on camera.
Right. No, it's, man, I tell kids that all the time, especially my 16-year-old. I'm like, yeah, man, you can't get away with what I used to get away with as a kid. Yeah, I mean, you can't even have that, that fun where, you tell your parents about it 20 years later when you're not going to get your butt kicked. I was like, those days no longer exist. And I
No.
tell these kids, I'm like, stop recording every little thing you do. It is not the flex that you think it is.
Right. It's actually evidence against you. So, try not to record it and remember there's probably a camera on you from somewhere. So
Right.
that's made it difficult. But I think politically, we've always had the media involved. I talk about it in the book that even the time of Aaron Burr and Hamilton started the New York Post, still around, but a lot of these guys own newspapers or financially supported them, and they were basically biased. Not much different than we have now with cable news and even, regular news, the newspapers and so forth. So that hasn't really changed, just the form in which it comes out. And we have more outlets. We have podcasts. We have bloggers. You know, like I said, I owned some newspapers. Yeah, I could do that even when I didn't have money because you only needed a little bit to paper out. And then when it went digital, you're able to pretty much produce whatever you want and upload it and you're done. And it was very cost efficient. What does it cost for a website every year? I hope I'm not giving
Couple
people
$100.
ideas that they're going to go out and be.
It was, I forget who am I thinking of? Chris Kumo. I think
Yeah.
he's on Newsmax now, and he even came out and said, he goes, "Yeah, I didn't agree with everything I said. They pretty much told me to say this." And then I believe Chris, or not Chris Todd, Chuck Todd both said that essentially they were told not to talk about Biden's issues,
Yeah.
his competency, and Chuck Todd, after I don't know if he retired or got let go, I can't remember, but he brought that point up on a podcast. He goes, "Yeah, I was told not to bring it up." And they both said without saying it, because I'm pretty sure they probably could have got sued if they just outright said it.
Yeah.
They're pretty much saying, "Hey, I was told what to say and sprinkle my own little opinions in here and there."
Yeah. I mean, there's probably an expectation, right? If you're working for CNN or MSNBC or even Fox, there's probably an expectation that you stick to, if not the script, the general theme. We don't want
Yes.
you out there
Yes.
blowing things up because unfortunately, that's who's watching. So I think
Right.
it's interesting. Scott Jennings is on CNN, but it's a panel, it's like 5 people
Yeah.
and they're against him. And he's fighting everyone, like anybody that's coming near him. It's almost like one of those old, Bruce Lee movies. He's kicking people. And it's very difficult.
Yeah.
He does a good job. I mean,
Yeah, I love Scott Jennings. I watch his stuff all the time.
yeah, but it's like, gee, you'd like it to be a little bit more balanced. Like, okay, if we're going to have 5 people here, could we have 2 Scott Jennings? And you could have
Right.
3 or 4 on your side? Because I think he does take care of 3 or 4 himself, but it seems a little unfair in the discussions. Those networks really aren't looking to make it fair because by and large, the viewers aren't sitting there, aren't conservative. They're more likely liberal. They're going to change the channel to something else. They'll go to MSNBC or whatever it's called now, MS Now or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It's MS Now. Well, we're like with CNN. The one thing I noticed is since Trump won, obviously they're still fairly on the liberal side, but they have definitely shifted significantly towards the center
Mm.
and how they're approaching things. Not necessarily all their coverage, but their approach seems to be a little bit more centered. And then that's when you started to see the rise of Scott Jennings on there because now they're going, because before, I mean, they would have Republicans on there, but it was the Republicans who hated Trump. So it was kind of like
Yeah,
we hate Trump, so we're all friends type of thing.
right.
And it was like, so it was kind of like, you're kind of like, and I mean, if I wanted to know what I don't like about someone, I mean, I could just do that myself. I'm about the substance, man. Like, tell me why you think it's going to be an issue. Don't tell me that you just don't like the guy.
Right. That's just, cover Republicans, right? So you put Kinzinger on, who, he's gone totally off the deep end against Trump. It's like, well, you're not adding anything to it. Give me someone
Right.
who is going to, tell me why Trump is right on certain issues. Maybe not all of them, but some issues. And
Yeah.
Jennings, I think some of that CNN is based on the fact that there's, an expectation they're going to be sold and that the Ellisons, Larry Ellison was going to purchase them. And if he did, perhaps move them more to the right. So maybe they're moving to the right or at least center. I mean, I think that's needed. When CNN started, they were the network you went to. You didn't go to AB.
Right. I remember.
That was the news. Something happened in the country or even worldwide. You turned on CNN. Somewhere along the line, they lost that, probably because they had Chris Cuomo and others who were going far left. And a lot of viewers said, I'm not watching this. It's not fair. Because generally, isn't that what we want? We want some kind of fairness. If you give me a balanced approach, I'm likely to watch your network. But it's hard to find that balanced approach anywhere, unfortunately.
It is. I'm a center right politically. I definitely try to be because there's some things I think that the left has pretty decent ideas on. But the problem, and before we'll go on per se, like the next thing is, the messaging in this country thrives on urgency, right? But the government does not. A lot of things, but it's the cultural fights that seem to be dominating over like people will fight about woke, whatever you want to call it these days, over a bill that's going to be passed that's going to rob them blind. Like they'll completely ignore something that's going to ruin their lives economically and make it 10 times harder to live just so they can fight the cultural fight that really doesn't even impact them.
Yeah. Or it's not the immediate impact. They might be looking down the road to say this is going to affect my children or the way we live or something. But yes, I think people have given up on some of those financial fights. Or do they think, a pox on both houses? Nobody cares about keeping tax bills low. And to some extent, at least with local politicians, that's often true. You'll see where
Yeah.
they talk themselves into, we have to raise taxes. Well, you don't have to. I mean, we could look at cutting some things there, but when you ask them, like, what
Oh
did
yeah.
you cut? Well, we couldn't cut a thing. Really? I mean, I worked for the state of Illinois under a Republican administration. And at that time, that was back in the 90s. And I can tell you, we would sit in the Chicago office, and the fact we were sitting there, maybe we should have been the ones cut, but we designated, like, how many people could we get rid of who are doing nothing? They're not adding anything to this organization. And
Right.
I think it was 10% just off the top of our heads that we knew were extra weight. They were there for politics or for whatever other reason. And you're like, that was a Republican administration. Now we've had some Democrat administrations. I don't know what it is. I'm not there, but I suspect it's at least 10%. I think it's probably more, because when I've tried to deal with the state offices, they've been very lax in responding to anything. They still think it's COVID. They're all working at home. They don't respond right away. Like, I don't know. We always picked up the phone. It was sitting on the desk. And certainly if you would go on, you return that call. You made sure you returned it that day. 6 days later, like, oh, I've been working at home. Well, doesn't your phone go to your house? What are you doing at home if you can't answer it? So I I think there's a lot of waste there, but both parties often think, well, nobody's really complaining, or, they'll buy into it anyhow because they're on my side. And maybe we did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's essentially, like, real power doesn't shout, right? It's a lot more silent than people think. Real power doesn't shout. It's it's footnotes more than anything, and I think that that's one of the most underrated things. And to me, it just goes to show the issues we have, in our education system. And I'm a adamant advocate of getting rid of the 17th Amendment and making the Senate reappointed by the states.
Really?
I am all for because you have the U.S. House, which is
Yeah.
popularly voted, and when you look at who gets things done, the House can get bills done quick, no matter who's controlling it. Even if they have to get a couple people from the other side, they figure out a way to get it done.
Hmm.
Even in this divided environment, the Senate, that's where everything goes to die. But if the Senate was appointed by the states, well, the people elected their government for the state, and the state governments generally try to do a pretty good job of addressing the needs of their citizens. They try,
Hmm.
and they're a lot more accountable. Well, if you got senators that are appointed by those states, they're going to have to be a lot more accountable to the state government, because the state government's problems are fairly similar usually to their constituents. Whereas you'd have a lot less political money swaying things in the Senate.
That's interesting. But here's the thing. I mean, some of the problems are the Senate rules, right? And we have the blue slip that they're talking about a lot now, where, any senator can block appointments. And for instance, Trump can't get U.S. attorneys appointed. And when he does appoint them, they run out because of temporary. And it's insanity. One guy can stop this. And then you have to get to this whole, 60 votes, which seems a little undemocratic, but why do we have to get to 60? We can't, neither party can get to 60 votes, and neither party wants to vote with the other party, with the exception of maybe a few Republicans and a couple of Democrats might switch here or there, but it's rare. I mean, very rare, right? Fetterman was some
I love that guy.
things, and isn't that amazing? Fetterman became like a hero to Republicans recently, but and hated by Democrats. But, back when he was running, Republicans were like, this guy has no cognitive skill. He had a stroke. What's he doing? And Democrats were
Yeah.
defending it like, he should be able to run if he wants to run. What's the big deal? Now they all hate him. And,
Right. What he's what did they call back in the 90s? Blue dog Democrat.
yeah.
To me, he's very reminiscent of a blue dog Democrat. One of those old school, he's got common sense, and he doesn't buy into the political bait.
Right. I've heard him a few times, and I do think he's one of those guys. I don't know if this is a medical truth or not, but I think that stroke made him smarter. He seems to
Yeah.
be much smarter than he was, at least to the point, like, he argues about why is the party, so anti-Israel. You could have a split on it. You could have different opinions, but the way they're just so anti-Israel and they're so anti-ICE, and I think he's right, especially when you're running in Pennsylvania. You can't sit there and think Pennsylvania's going to elect you being so far to the left. I mean, you might get away with that once.
Right.
I mean, they're kind of a middle of the road state, a swing state, So
Yeah.
he's being smart.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of that, like legal frameworks shape outcomes, right? Kind of like relating to your book with that. But, people argue policy, but it seems like sometimes they miss like the legal like structure that's underneath it, and they buy into just the simplicity. And I'll give a quick example, and then, maybe related to your book is when they were, the government was shut down over healthcare subsidies. I looked at everybody and I said, mark my words, right after the November election, within a week, they'll have it back open.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, no, no. Guess what? They had it back open because both sides were playing it to hopefully get their edge on the election. And then, where they're baiting people, and I stress this all the time, and I get so much pushback from the right and the left. They go, oh, the right people be like, oh, you're a crazy liberal, or right, people on the left will be like, oh, you're a crazy conservative, and I go, why is nobody outside of a couple people in government going, why aren't we talking about the fact that these subsidies just give a blank check to the insurance industry with almost very little oversight of it? And why aren't we addressing the cost? Like, healthcare could be accessible to everybody at a lower cost if it was made capitalist, because it's not a capitalist system. It's an oligarchy inside of the medical industry. The government picks the players, the ones allowed to be there. They limit it. That's it. And anybody who has lived in America beyond 5 years can tell you that you limit the competition, prices go up.
Yeah. And I think the problem, you see subsidies for, insurance, and you're like, okay, it's similar to what we did with education or higher education. We gave more loans, more money into the education system, and then we complained that college became unaffordable. Well, yes, because what did the universities do? They just jacked everything up. Now, if your, tuition was 10,000, guess what? It's 17, then it's 25. And it gets to the point where the universities are sitting there saying, well, the government's paying for it, right? Which isn't true. These loans are paid for it. And then the student ultimately should be paying for it because they have to pay it back. Whether they know that or not, we can debate, but they should know it. But they're kind of victims of that whole system, especially if you're young. You might not have known going into it. Your parents, they just want you to go to college. They're looking at it like, well, this will all work out. Well, it's not going to work out because you're going to be owing so much money. You're not going to be able to buy that house, which a lot of them can't. And I think with insurance, we have the same thing. We've poured these subsidies in there, and what's happened? We've had the prices go out of sight. You have, pharmaceutical companies. You can't. God, there's so many ads. It's almost like they're the only ads on TV. And
I know.
There's an ad. You have something that they're advertising. You're not sure what it is. There's things they name, and I'm like, I've never heard of that. Pretty sure I don't have it. I'm not going to try to find out if I have it, but they've got a pill for it, or they have a shot for it. We're the only country that allows advertising for pharmaceutical, and it's insane. People, then go to their doctors. I asked my doctor, do people actually come in here and tell you, hey, I think I should take this or that? He said, yes, all the time. I said, I couldn't.
Yeah, my doctor told me the same thing.
I said I couldn't be a doctor for two reasons. First, no self-respecting medical school would ever let me in. But secondly, I'd have to strangle someone that came in and told me that. That's like, as a lawyer, if people tell you this is how we should handle the case. And I had a client do that in the middle of a trial, tell me, I think we should put this. I'm like, no, I don't care what you think. We're doing it my way. We're not doing that. It's silly, and I can't imagine being a doctor and having someone say, yeah, I need to get this certain prescription for something. No, I'm not doing that. So I probably have no patience. Either way, either patience in the fact that I probably want to strangle them and not have anyone coming to me.
Yeah. I mean, but that feeds into, like another thing, right? Where it's a different decade, the same dynamics, like everybody talks about Trump being a populist, and ironically, I got an episode coming out soon that's going to be on the great switch, it supposedly happened back in the day.
Yeah.
Well, it happened again because now the GOP essentially hijacked the working class vote. But in that and related to like, what you're saying, right? Elites rebrand, but or what we like to call the elites, but they rarely relinquish that control factor.
Yeah. And I think, the elites come in all different shapes, right? We used to talk about elites being the country club Republicans. They were the ones that never got their hands dirty and, you'd laugh about them. I grew up as a Democrat family, um, involved. My dad was involved knocking on doors, precinct work. And that's where I learned to do it. Now, I became the first Republican in the family. A shame when you're in Illinois, the Chicago area. You you don't have too many Republicans. But
Man,
but the thing is, that's what I saw. Like the Republicans that I knew, they never really wanted to do the work to get it done. And they looked down on the working class, basically. Now that's completely changed, as you say. Trump appealed to the workers. And I think especially in this last election, you saw the number of working class people. And I talked to a union leader here who said, he likes to give money to both Democrats and Republicans, and he wished the Republicans here would be more inclined to support labor. He said, because 70% of my members want to vote that way anyhow. And he said, probably
yeah,
over half do. They don't listen because they want to vote and support these Republican initiatives, but the Republicans here are doing things that don't coincide with what the labor unions want to do.
yeah. Here the UAW supported Biden, and then when you would drive around Metro Detroit, you'd see, I support the UAW, and then next to it you see a Trump van sign. And it was like, I'm like, yeah, the UAW may have supported Biden, but their workers sure didn't. Not at least not all of them.
And what good does that do to say I've got the union support when you really have the union workers not following that because they saw something in Trump, whether it's his promises or, the idea of the tariffs, and maybe just the lived experience of having seen jobs leave where they
Yes.
know that hasn't worked. The way the union leadership has gone for them, constantly been going with the Democrat candidate, it's not working. Trump is speaking to them directly, and I think they bought those arguments pretty easily.
Yeah, no, and for sure. And maybe give the viewers or listeners, depending which platform you're on, like, how does that like play into your book? Like, like, because, we've talked about some good things, like how can they sink their teeth into that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot in the book about Trump and the battles he had, but also his appeal that he has to just Americans in general. And we get this every so often, right, with politicians. I kind of think it's like actors. There's something about certain actors that you go, I don't, because I always get a kick out of people saying, well, he's a great actor. And you think, is he, or did he just have a great part? Somebody wrote the part for him, and it appears that he was able to read those lines pretty well. But could anybody do that that's an actor? And some people have that. It's that something special when you look at them and they just know that for a politician, you either believe them, you find they have charisma. I think, John Kennedy had it. I think Bill Clinton had it too, Reagan.
Yeah.
But then, the Bushes struggled with that. They struggled very, very
Yeah,
difficult.
they're flat.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton struggled, even though her husband had charisma, she really didn't. And I think if you go back in history, you'll see that Trump has it. He has it different than other people because he's all over the board, right? He'll start talking about things and you're like, I'm sure that's not written down. I saw a speech like a week or so ago he was talking, I think he was talking to reporters. It wasn't actually a speech. He was responding to questions. And he said that his wife had told him to quit the dancing stuff, that he's being foolish and people are laughing at him. And he said, no, they love it. They love when I dance. They're calling for me to dance. And so he's telling these, I think it was reporters, and he said, Melania said to him, do you think FDR would have done that? And Trump looks off to the side and says, she might have to brush up on history. Like, he just has a way to, that makes you laugh. And at the same time, and then he went on to like praise FDR, which is like, that he was a great man or something. I thought there's something about him that people are watching that and they think he's funny. And they also think he's like them, even though, he's a billionaire and probably isn't much like the auto worker or the
No.
other union guys we're talking about, but they think he is.
Yeah, I mean, but it goes back to, I'm trying to think of kind of like JFK. JFK kind of really got a lot of people behind him because everybody felt cheated. When everyone feels screwed, something deeper in the country is broken.
Yeah.
And JFK, granted, there was a lot of Republicans who didn't like him, but he appealed to it enough to really get like a wave in. And then something that I think people forget, your book talks a lot about patterns, is Richard Nixon won, I believe if I'm right, he won all 50 states in his first election.
Yeah.
Right. So I think people forget about that. And then, everybody, oh, well, Obama got the most amount of votes. And it's like, yeah, that's great, but we don't run on the popular vote here. We run on the electoral college.
Right.
Reagan was, I believe, the other one that he got 49 to 50 in his second term.
Right.
And it's just, and what people don't realize is, and why, I like some of your stuff is, it's that pattern. When people feel a certain way, the person may change, the technology may change, but it's the same.
Yeah. And I think you can't stop that. Like when you look at campaigns and people talk like, what could I have done differently? Whether it's local or presidential, it's like, sometimes there's nothing you could have done. You did everything you could, but that wave was already up there and, somebody captured it and they're going to win. And, one of those elections, I mean, it's kind of funny with Nixon, he crushed McGovern, but that's the election when he actually, his henchmen or whatever, had the Watergate scandal. They didn't have to break into the Watergate. What are you doing breaking in? We're winning this thing. Somehow they must not have known how well they were doing. But, you did something that was absolutely unnecessary. You were going to win no matter what. And you didn't realize that for whatever reason. Sometimes, there's guys like, I always look at H.W. Bush. He, they said, hey, the economy, it's the economy, stupid. And at the time I thought, well, I'm doing fine. I don't know. I always look at it like there's, let's say there's 340 million Americans. And like, well, everybody has their own economy, right? If you're doing fine, you don't really notice it. Reagan mentioned with, if your neighbor loses a job, it's a recession. If you lose your job, it's a depression. Yes.
I mean, he's not wrong. You're not wrong at all.
Right. And you look at that and you go, well, I'm doing fine. I didn't see that with Bush. And the numbers were actually getting better, but they were moving too slowly, which is kind of a lesson here for Trump. If these numbers don't move quickly, are you going to have a problem in the midterms? Where if they move quicker and people feel better, it's that feeling like, well, things are much better. They certainly felt that way for 2024 for Trump, where people were like, I'm done with the Biden stuff. I'm done with all this leftist ideas. That's not working for me. I'm not paying, $9 for eggs or whatever they were. I think gas is too much. I'm going with this other guy who dances and, gets shot in the ear and gets back up and says fight. Most of us would probably be crawling out, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I get shot in the ear. These guys are going to carry me out. I'm not smart enough to stand up and say fight. I'm like, get me out of here. They're attacking me. But for whatever reason, he saw that as an opportunity. Good political instinct. So maybe that's what ties them all together. Those guys that come off as charismatic, they just have that it factor where you say, oh, I mean, Bill Clinton, they they talked about Gotti being the Teflon Don, but Clinton, there's women talking about things he did when he's running. It's like just bouncing off of him. They didn't care. He
Yes.
was going to win. It didn't matter. And it's like, why are we even holding an election? This guy's winning. I don't know why, but he is.
Well, Bill Clinton, my gosh, he was such I did a show with a guy, God, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. I've recorded so many, his book was called, I think something like The Clinton Consequences, and how that kind of started, not necessarily blaming them, right? But the Monica Lewinsky scandal kind of pushed America in this direction where certain things were just okay. Whereas before it might have been seen as taboo.
Yeah.
Definitely a different way of looking at it. And I was very shocked. And I'm like, I guess I really didn't think about it like that. I was like, okay. I'm like, I mean, you're not wrong, buddy.
Yeah.
He was like, well, and I'm like,
one of the things,
no, it makes a lot of sense.
But I think with some of that, I don't know if it's the first time, but now we have these, you're really in the bunker, so to speak, right? You're with your guy, and your guy, no matter what he's doing, is right. And I think maybe we'd have to look is that when it really started, when Democrats were saying, he's lying, but, he's married. He's trying to
right.
keep his marriage. Wouldn't you lie? Well, yeah, sure I would. And, it's only sex. And then, all these excuses that you start coming up with. And then maybe you start doing that for all of your, you back these candidates maybe too much, or presidents even, when you talk about Bush, yeah, we're supporting, Republicans are sitting there supporting, well, yeah, we're going in, we're going to bomb Iraq, we're going to and it's like, because they have weapons of mass destruction. You get there, where are they? I don't know. So what's our excuse? They moved them. There's, they were there. But you'll come up with any reason to say your guy was right. And
yes,
I think that's continued. No matter what the reason is, you're standing by your guy. Like, is it Tammy Wynette would stand by your man? We just refuse to say, you know what? Maybe he was wrong on that one. Maybe you shouldn't lie under oath. Maybe you shouldn't go into other countries under a false pretense. And but it does. We are in bunkers now. We're just firing off at the other side, and it's not good. I think you see it now with the ICE enforcement, where Democrats. I've had people say, I don't understand it. Yeah, I don't either. I don't know how you are in favor of people that aren't even citizens of this country compared to law enforcement officials of the federal government who are just following the law. They're just making a living following the law. And they're now the bad guys in the eyes of that bunker, the bunker to the left. They're like, that's a problem. Really? Maybe we shouldn't fight on this one. Maybe we ought to just say, take these guys out of here, or cooperate, turn over the criminals. Maybe cut a deal at that point with, maybe we can do something for the ones that are, law abiding. It gets to the point that the bunker on the right they're saying, no, if you're not going to cooperate, I want them all gone. I mean, I've heard some people say, I not only want the illegals gone, I want the people supporting the illegals deported. Like, I don't know if we can deport Americans, but I understand your anger.
No, I mean, it's, people, they're forgetting history doesn't make us modern, it makes us manipulable. It's, historical ignorance makes every problem feel unprecedented. A lot of people don't forget is some of these tricks that they're using are just remodified stuff that was used, whenever ago. And, and then I don't think, God, it's been a long time since I've been in school, so they may have taught this. George Washington warned us against a two political party system, owned two parties. He said that, he didn't say, I forget the exact wording, but essentially it was like, it'll tear us apart in so many words.
Yeah, he did. And he warned about, unscrupulous men, and they only used men then. He didn't know there'd be unscrupulous women in the government. He didn't foresee that. We have unscrupulous of both genders, and that they would take advantage of that and use it. And he was right.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if we could have survived without the two-party system, because there's some good to it, back and forth. But it's become so, where they just refuse to bend at all, that at this point, his words seem prophetic, right? That you were right, George. We we screwed this up. No, it's some 200 years later, but yeah, you're right. Yeah, but that was his farewell address. He did that, and it's interesting. He said that Lincoln had done a speech well before the Civil War talking about how people can't disregard the law. At that time, there were several happenings, I think, where people were taking the law into their own hands, hanging people without a trial or anything, and said you can't have a system where there's a disregard for the law. And others have talked about, we can't keep the country as it is if we, fight about all these things. That's the threat's going to be ourselves. It's going to come from ourselves, not from other nations or invaders. No one's going to invade the U.S. And, well, I believe that's true. They're not going to be able to invade and take the U.S. We are doing a great job of invading our own minds with silliness.
Yeah, we can which one was it? I can't forget which Soviet leader essentially said that we don't need to go there. They'll just push certain things and we'll destroy ourselves.
I think that was
I can't
Khrushchev.
think of that leader's name.
I think it was Khrushchev.
Yeah, so he looking backwards, wasn't wrong. And I think if people actually knew what he said, and this goes for the left and the right, if they knew how the Soviets thought about it, the Soviet Union may no longer be around, but some of the things they said that they would try to implement in American society to make us weaker is what you see happening now.
Right. And that is one of the pet peeves where you're whether these are paid agitators that are out there doing it, which I suspect they are, and are they trying to take the country down? It's one thing to say I'm trying to change it for the better, because that's the American way. You get to do that, Now, you don't get to do it with foreign money or foreign agitation. If you can convince your fellow Americans to vote a certain way, okay, you win. But they're getting people. I mean, socialism was a dirty word when I was in school. I mean,
yeah, same here.
Right? And I wouldn't say that they had to teach us a lot of the rah-rah American stuff, but there was some of it there, certainly with versus the Soviet Union, communism. But the presidents, all the parties were against that too. You didn't have a Democratic Party that seemed to lean to socialism. And we have, in the city of Chicago, there's 50 aldermen, and I want to say now there's about 16 to 20 that are socialists. They ran as socialists. Now they say socialist or democratic socialist.
I know.
What's the difference?
That's a funny word.
They all say, yeah, you go to countries that have gone communist, they all said they were democratic socialists too. You're just making up labels. How anybody, votes for that? And then you have college students who come home and tell their parents, they're socialists. What do you mean you're a socialist? As they live in a huge house with, dad goes to work and brings in all the money, they're socialists.
Oh, yeah, don't get me going on that one. Don't get me going on that one. Yeah, I mean, socialism, it's finding that balance again. I use Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill as a really good example. Like they broke that mold, where your book talks about that repetitive pattern,
Mhm.
they broke that mold, right? They were able to be those bitter enemies per se, Capitol Hill, but they also, because of their personal relationship, they were able to understand each other as humans and as men, and they were able to get things done, even though they couldn't stand, the ground that each other walked on politically.
Right. And that's missing completely now, it seems, right? I mean,
Oh man.
I don't know that I've ever heard Chuck Schumer say anything nice about Trump since he's been elected.
And they were best friends before he got elected.
Right. And I know Trump has said things that were nice about him. He's a good man or something, but he sure hasn't shown that. The funny thing is with Trump, I believe back in 2016, he was the perfect guy for the Democrats to make a deal with. He's a deal. You see him now, He's making deals all over the world, but he wanted to make a deal. They've pushed him, and I think the Republican Party, towards this MAGA movement much quicker than it ever was planned. I think he wanted to go in, make deals on certain things, come to a consensus. I think that's what he really thought of him. Now that hasn't been the case, but I think it mostly falls on this idea, this bunker mentality, that you are against the other guy because we have an election in 2 years and we'll take back whatever, the House, the Senate.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's what year? I think was it in the 40s when Republicans lost control of the House and took them,
Yeah,
Lord knows,
I think,
how long.
yeah, until Gingrich won with the contract with America. I think it was like
Yes,
45 years, right? So it was a long
yeah,
time. And, he basically quarterbacked that whole thing by keeping his word. This is what we're going to do. Here's the 10 points or whatever it was. And, this is what you can count on. And people responded to that. They wanted to know, okay, if we do vote for you, how do we win this thing? And what do we get out of it? But yeah,
right. No, I mean that's who is it? Did they get control of the Senate? I can't remember that off the top of my head.
yeah, I think that was like 94. Yes, because
Right.
Clinton made a move to the right at that point, and they balanced the budget. They started looking at the deficit, things that Gingrich wanted to do.
Yes.
And often Clinton now gets credit for it, which is kind of funny because I think the only reason he did it was, I can fight with these guys and get nowhere, or I'm going to get some things passed and get reelected.
He's used common sense, which does not seem to be very common these days.
No,
They who is it? God, I'm trying to think of, I can't think of the person's name right now. I'm drawing a blank. I don't know why, but history doesn't necessarily, repeat because it wants to. It repeats because we let it. The one thing I think people forget is our country has been through these same divisions before multiple times. And somehow we do find a way back to the middle to some degree.
to some degree, it's always happened. I don't know, we just seem to be getting further and further apart. There was an interesting concept. Who wrote it? It was in town hall the other day about, was America destroying itself? And I think it's Mark Lewis wrote it, who's a historian. And it's a
Mhm.
question that's been asked before. Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about a national divorce. I forget, someone wrote a book, about splitting the country. You guys take the left side, we'll take the right side. All those
Jeez.
ideas actually make the country weaker. You now got two weaker parts than one strong part. But it's gotten to the point where people detest the other side. There's no discussion. You can't sit down and say, well, let's, like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, let's have a drink and we'll talk about this, see if we can come to an agreement on the tax code, for instance. Like, okay. And they did. You'll get some people argue they shouldn't have still, but
No, it was needed at the time, and our country benefited immensely from it.
yeah. And
I think that's
well, often it is. You take certain steps that you have to take, and then history might not treat it well. As time goes on, it's like, oh, well, what would you have done in that time? In that time, you'd make the same decision, but, who knows when you find
what do
out
they
the
say?
whole.
Hindsight's always 20/20.
Yeah. I mean, that's where it comes
You
from,
know,
right? The idea that I could always look at the past and tell you what you should have done. Yeah. I mean, and it's, like you say, history, the whole book really talks about what happened to Burr and what happened to Trump. And for Burr, I think what struck me, one of the reasons I wrote the book, Trump was always saying, this is the first time in history, which, when he says those types of things, a lot of it's hyperbole. And, you look back, you're like, well, to a president, yes. But Burr was vice president. He was a big deal, and this man was charged with treason, something we hear all the time now, that everybody's treasonous. If you don't like the guy, he's committed treason. Like, well, it's hard to commit treason. We don't charge a lot of people with that because it's very hard. Burr went through things that I think most people don't know about. Basically, made him penniless, certainly ruined his name. I think most of us thought, I did too, is, oh, it's that famous duel with Hamilton. You shoot and kill a guy in a duel, that's probably going to ruin your political career. But it's more than
Yes.
that. It's the whole, what they call the Burr conspiracy and being charged with treason that really ruined his political career. Trump had the same issue, with all the cases against him. And there's a lot of comparisons made in the book, but, what I can tell you is Jefferson, who I, think is one of the greatest Americans ever, played a part in that, in the lawfare. So you can be someone who's thought of as one of the greatest presidents like Jefferson, doing things that, are really not in the best interests of America. And you can have someone like Joe Biden, where it's hard to find anything that he did that was in the best interest of America. Both had this similar pattern of going after, someone they perceived to be an opponent. So, it's interesting that hasn't changed in all those years. And the commonality might be just we're all human. And we see it a lot in local campaigns where everybody tries to one up the other guy, and you put out literature, and it's like then the other side puts out literature that's even worse. Then you put out something that's even worse. We were doing that. I was doing that in a campaign. One of the things they were constantly, we said, lying. And we said, you know what? I've got a better idea. I'm going to put a video out. And we gave a video to everybody in the district. And, that people went crazy for it, because it's like, wait a minute, they did something completely different. I'm not just taking this and throwing it out, which most literature in the mail now seems to be thrown out, because we're in the,
Yeah, I mean,
right? Do you read?
I mean, I still get, what do they call it? Snail mail. I still get snail mail, but half the time I'm like, what is this for? I've never even heard of this. And then I'm like, okay, I'm
Yeah.
done with this one.
Yeah, and I've heard people say I take that from the front door to the back door and throw it in the garbage. And it's because they've
Yes.
already made up their mind. What they're looking for is, well, what did my guy, I'm with my guy at my party, and they're not really looking for any difference, unfortunately. It
Yes.
would be nice if you could actually reach those people. I don't know, how you do that anymore. It's, used to be you could knock on their door and talk to them. But, I don't know if I'd answer my door for anybody now. Between,
No.
are they criminals?
Nope.
They're either criminals, or there's someone trying to sell me something, or they're politicians who I don't want to hear from. So,
I don't even get too many political people coming to the doors anymore these days.
Yeah,
It's definitely like gone way down.
yeah, they've avoided it because I think it doesn't work. You're not home, or you don't answer, sometimes out of fear of safety. You're going to answer the door when you don't know who this guy really is.
No, for sure. So, tell everybody how all this like wraps into your book, because, like the gist of it, I think if people actually sit down and pay attention, because when people find patterns and they get comfortable with them, no matter where you're at, no matter what it is, whether it's feeding the dog, a dog eats at 7:00 every day, and it repeats, the people get in line with it. And that's what makes your book so compelling. Tell them about that. How does that all like, just wrap it up? Like, how does that all blends in?
Yeah, I think what you notice when you read it is a lot of the things that we face now, we've faced over the course of history as a country, and individuals, whether it's one party or the other, it's not always the same party. We've had, politicians, act using lawfare, for instance, that's always been something out there that you try to get an advantage over. And we've always had this extra, special, you have the media, which is always playing a part, and the biases they bring into it. And through all that, you see these battles and you tend to think, oh, this only happened this time, because we kind of forget history. We really do. And, when they say we're doomed to repeat it, yes, we are, because none of us are paying attention in class. We're looking out the window, or I don't know, looking at the clock, hoping it becomes 3:00 so we can go home. Whatever the reason, we don't, or maybe there's too much. Maybe there's just too much and they pile it on you. Whatever the reason, we tend to forget. But you'll see, guys can be like Aaron Burr, for instance. He was a good man. And a lot of these people they're elected. Burr fought in the Revolutionary War. He was, loved by Washington. He was a good statesman when he was in the General Assembly in New York. They kind of plucked him out of nowhere and, he became the vice president. And he found what many have found that go to Washington. You don't have friends and you won't make any friends. And I think Trump found that out too. How many years later, Trump went in there having some friends who I think he lost pretty quickly and making a lot more enemies. So what you have is kind of a country that's constantly had this struggle and this battle with all these outside forces. And part of it is they call the deep state. You tend to think, oh, that's something that Trump, came up with. But there's been battles that have been chronicled in other books. Kennedy fought what was known as the deep state, and Reagan did. They're different fights, but they're deep state. Theodore Roosevelt did. Lincoln did. Now, there's actually been 5 of those battles that are actually recorded as deep state. I would say there was always a deep state.
Always.
When Aaron Burr was out there and they were going after him for treason, they were using all the resources of the government. You had, the U.S. attorney that was prosecuting him in Kentucky was related to Madison. It's like, wait a minute. And you had, same guy had an ownership in the media, and you had the media being owned by the political parties and being supported, much like we have now. The book details how we have all these links to politicians in our media, and it's hard to see how we've even survived this long. But all of that stuff has worked, and we've always overcome it, and we'll continue to overcome it. But the guys who were affected by it are often not written about. You see some people like Trump. He overcame a lot to get to the second election and win. Burr couldn't do it. Maybe if he had, the media that Trump had, and Trump just has that factor, whatever that it thing is, where he brought his fight right to the people. Like, he put none of his faith in the government and the judicial system and his own lawyers. It was all about, he started this thing of he'd leave the courthouse and go talk to the reporters after the trial. And if you're an attorney, you're sitting there going, stop it. Quit talking. You're not helping. But he actually was helping. Because his battle was really public opinion. Can I change what people think out there, what they're hearing from the media? And can I explain to them why I'm being railroaded? Because he was looking at the real test is going to be, can I get elected? And to his credit, it worked. People said that worked. They voted for him.
Yeah. I mean, tell everybody the name of your book again, just so we can highlight that.
It's DC Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump, and there's similar battles. It's I have it on my website, which is author.dennisbrennan.com. Amazon.com has it. Barnes & Noble has it. You might have to put the title there or put my name in to find it on those sites, but you can find it. And it's also available at 50 other locations. I think what they told me to say is where all good books are sold.
Yeah, no, I mean, people check that book out. I'll make sure the links are in the description and in the show notes and all that good stuff. And everybody, don't forget to check out their, we release a show. There's always an article that I make with it. All the links will be in there, synopsis of his book. Check it out. This is what I try to always tell everybody. This is the stuff that you want to know. You want to know the stuff, even if it makes you uncomfortable, because it's usually the first sign that you're learning something real. We've got to learn patterns. Humans we're habit, creatures of habit. This stuff matters. Like it matters more than people realize, and it's the founding fathers even said it to know these. Whoops. There we go. Took care of that. To know these things, to learn the lessons of history so we're not doomed to keep repeating them. And unfortunately, we're not there. Is there any closing comments you want to give these folks?
I think you hit on an important fact there, and it leads me, when I've had people tell me at times, well, you're a Republican or you're biased in doing it. So how can you talk about the media or whatever? The one thing I made sure we did in this book is everything's referenced. So, while there might be a slant here or there from my opinion, because you can't get around that if you write, it's you try not to do it on every sentence, but it's referenced, so there's some backup. So when people read it, they can check it out themselves and go, well, he's not making it out, up out of thin air. I'm not just pulling facts and figures that I made up. There's actual references to other books or studies, polls, whatever, that can support any of those positions. It's not there to convince anybody, but if it educates people that are, you know, maybe there'll be a little less hate against Trump, or maybe those that support can put it up on their bookshelf and say, well, now if someone in my family or my friends has a question, I can point it out here and it's referenced.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's people take that advice. Take a guy who's been a politician, lawyer, and knows about real estate. This guy knows, like, check it out. That's You always want to try to listen to someone who's been on the front lines to a degree, because they're going to have those little nuances that matter that a lot of people don't. But, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Check out Dennis's book. It's going to be great, especially if you love learning. It's not dry like some people's stuff are. It actually has good content. I'm Joe, and obviously this is Dennis. It's going to be a great author, and this is the middle ground, Mike. It's no left, no right. We just go forward. Thanks for tuning in tonight, everybody.